Two crew chiefs stood at the far end of the flight line with their hands in their jacket pockets, watching an old man push a cart, and neither of them could have told you why the night janitor locks a zippered canvas roll inside that cart every evening, or why nobody in 19 years has ever once seen what's inside it. "He does this every night," the shorter one said, nodding toward the gray shape moving along the tarmac. "Stops right there. Looks at it like it owes him money." "Maybe it does," the other said, and they both laughed. Quiet and easy. The kind of laugh that costs nothing because it is aimed at someone who will never hear it. 9 days. That was the number sitting over the whole flight line like weather. 9 days since the F-16 had rolled to a stop short of the arming area and simply refused on the 9th attempt to hold an idol worth trusting. 12 men from Fairbanks Diagnostics had been through it twice over, laptops tethered to its belly like it was a patient on monitors, and the fault code that should have told them something told them nothing at all. 3 days now stood between that dead airframe and a flyover scheduled to retire a flag over a stadium full of people who would never know an engine had died 9 times to get there. A laminated flowchart, 41 steps long, had been run start to finish twice, and at step 41 both times it simply ended, the way a hallway ends at a door that isn't there. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the quietest person in the room, you already know how this one turns. Rewind 9 days to the evening it started, and the tarmac is only beginning to learn where its trouble lives. The lights along the flight line come up in stages after sunset. First the amber perimeter strand, then the white wash over the maintenance apron, and Otis Ledbetter's cart is already moving before the second stage finishes warming. He takes the same route every night, west hangar to east, the wheels of the cart ticking over the same expansion joints in the concrete in the same order, and he has never once needed to look down to know where they are. His right shoulder will not lift past the height of his own collarbone, hasn't in 11 years. So he turns his whole body to face anything worth facing, squared up like a man addressing a superior officer, even when what he is addressing is a trash can or a spool of safety wire left where it shouldn't be. The gray uniform shirt is buttoned to the throat regardless of the heat, pressed with a crease that no washing machine puts there on its own, and above the breast pocket a faded name tape reads, "Ledbetter," in letters gone the color of weak coffee. The canvas roll rides in the bottom tray of the cart, beneath the mop bucket, and each night before he locks the cart in the supply closet, he checks the zipper with 2 fingers, not looking at it, the way a man checks that his back door is shut before bed. He passes the grounded jet on this first night the way he has passed 100 others, except he doesn't pass it. He stops, sets the cart's brake with his boot heel, and lays one bare hand flat against the intake lip, the way you'd rest a hand on a horse's flank to feel it breathe. He holds it there 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then he takes his hand back, releases the brake, and keeps walking. And if you didn't know to look, you'd have called it nothing. Airman Sawyer Prescott was 22 years old and 6 months into a life of torque wrenches and 400 alarms, and he happened to be coiling an air hose 40 feet away when it happened. He didn't think much of it that first night. He thought a little more of it the second, when Otis did the same thing to a different aircraft entirely, one that had never thrown a single fault. By the 4th night, Sawyer had started keeping half an eye on the janitor's route without meaning to, the way you keep half an eye on weather building over a ridge. Not alarmed yet, just aware that something was arranging itself that hadn't been arranged before. "Man's got a system," Sawyer said to nobody, and went back to the hose. Spencer Fairbanks arrived on the morning of the 5th day the way he arrived everywhere, which was already talking. He came through the hangar bay door with his father's company logo stitched over his heart and a laminated flowchart clipped inside his jacket like a rosary, and by the time he reached the nose of the jet, he had already recited the first 6 steps of his own diagnostic sequence to an audience that hadn't asked for it. "Step 1, pressure differential across the control unit," he said, snapping open his laptop on a rolling stand. "Step 2, we cross-reference against the last accepted baseline. Step 3, he looked up, found 8 or 9 maintenance crew standing around him with their arms crossed, and seemed to enjoy that more than the jet itself. Step 3 is where everybody else stops looking and we keep going. That's the difference between a shop and a diagnostic practice. The suite ran clean for 40 minutes. No fault, no deviation outside tolerance. A green readout blinking its small green lie into a room full of people who wanted to believe it. Otis was near the back wall with a push broom, working a strip of floor that did not especially need working, and when a lull opened up in the noise, he said, without raising his voice or his eyes from the floor, "Check the linkage travel under load, not at rest. It binds when it's warm." Fairbanks turned around slow, the way a man turns when he has decided in advance to enjoy what comes next. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for the room. "Did the janitor just diagnose an F-16? A ripple of laughter went through the crew, thin and obliging. "Sir, respectfully, this suite has 41 recognized fault trees and about $600,000 of certified equipment behind it. I don't need a mop and a museum piece telling me where to look." Otis didn't answer. He looked at the linkage housing one more second, the way a man looks at a door he already knows won't open for him today, and went back to his broom. The wing's maintenance supervisor, a heavy-set master sergeant named Purdy, who had never once in 19 years had a crossword for Otis Ledbetter, still felt obligated to clear his throat and say, "Let's give the contractor his floor space, Otis." And Otis nodded once, collected his cart, and wheeled it off the flight line without a single word in his own defense. For 2 more nights, the pattern held its shape like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Fairbanks's suite ran the jet through every fault tree it owned and returned clean readings each time, green light after green light, and each time the engine turned over and settled into an idle that shuddered instead of held, like a man breathing wrong on purpose. The contractors adjusted, recalibrated, ran it again. Clean, clean, clean. A machine insisting, with total confidence, that nothing at all was the matter with something plainly the matter. Otis was seen only at the edges of those 2 nights, never in the middle of them. Once with a 1.5 foot of wooden dowel pressed to his good ear and its other end against the fuselage skin of an aircraft 2 bays over, listening to something with his eyes closed for the better part of a minute before moving on. Once standing at the tail of a 3rd jet entirely, one that had nothing wrong with it that anyone knew of, doing the same thing, as if he were checking a second patient's pulse to know what the first one's should sound like. Sawyer started writing it down. Not in any official log, a spiral notebook he kept in his cargo pocket, the kind meant for grocery lists, and in it he wrote times and tail numbers and 1 line each night. Dowell again, 3 jets tonight, doesn't write anything down himself. He noticed that last part hardest of all. A man checking 6 different engines by ear over 3 nights, and not 1 note taken, like the information went somewhere that didn't need paper. On the 7th night, he finally asked. He caught Otis at the cart, coiling the last stretch of the closet's extension cord around his forearm in the same 3 loops he always used, and Sawyer said, "Mr. Ledbetter, can I ask you something? What are you listening for, with the stick?" Otis kept coiling. When he answered, it was 1 sentence, delivered the way a man hands over exact change. "I'm listening for the part that isn't supposed to be there." He set the cord in the tray, locked the cart, checked the canvas roll zipper with 2 fingers, and pushed off toward the west hangar. And Sawyer stood there long enough that the tower's rotating beacon swept over him twice before he moved again. The 9th day arrived with Colonel Devin Gaines already on the flight line for a scheduled readiness inspection that had nothing to do with 1 grounded jet, which was the only reason he happened to be standing 30 feet from the nose gear when Sawyer Prescott did something that could have ended his career before it started. He walked straight up to Spencer Fairbanks, who was midway through packing his laptop into its case with the particular violence of a man who has run out of steps on his own flowchart, and said, "Give him 10 minutes. "Give who 10 minutes? "Ledbetter, the janitor. 10 minutes, and if he's wrong, I'll help you carry your gear to the truck myself." Fairbanks looked at the jet, then at the colonel standing within earshot, then at the 10 or 11 crew members who had gathered the way crowds gather around any argument that might turn into something worth telling later. Pride and audience make strange bedfellows, and it was mostly the audience that decided him. 10 minutes, he said, on the record that this is a courtesy. Otis set his cart's brake without being asked twice. He did not hurry. He opened the tray beneath the mop bucket, unzipped the canvas roll for the first time in front of another living soul, and drew out 2 things, a length of maple dowel worn pale and smooth at one end from 40 years of an ear pressed against it, and a small brass gauge, hand-filed, its edges gone soft and buttery with age, his own initials stamped crooked into one flat face where a 19-year-old machinist had learned to stamp letters before he'd learned to stamp them straight. He climbed the workstand without help, favoring the shoulder, turning his whole body square to the access panel the way he turned to face everything. He set the dowel against the fuel control housing and his ear against the dowel, and he held that position while the crew chief beside him ran the throttle up in slow, commanded steps, and Otis's free hand rose once, then twice, marking 2 RPM points in the air like a man conducting a hymn only he could hear. "There," he said. "Hold it there." He came down off the stand, knees taking the last foot, slow and careful, and had the panel access opened inside 90 seconds, his hands moving through fasteners he had not touched in real life for 22 years and had never once stopped touching in his head. He worked the linkage free, by feel more than by sight, turning the brass gauge over between 2 fingers, sliding it into the gap between the control arm and its stop, testing tension, testing travel, reading a tolerance no laptop had ever been told to look for because no laptop had ever been told such a part might exist there at all. "Fittings aftermarket," he said, mostly to himself. "Wrong shoulder radius. Rides true when she's cold and binds when she's hot, and your box only ever tests her cold." He backed the linkage out a hair's width, no more, seated it again, and checked it a second time with the gauge before he ever asked for the throttle again. "Bring her up," he said. The engine spooled, caught, and held, not the shudder of the last 9 days, but a flat, even hum that ran through the concrete under everyone's boots. Nobody on that apron said a word for 11 full seconds, and then somebody, nobody ever agreed on who, started clapping, and it caught the way fire catches dry grass. 40 minutes, start to the moment Colonel Gaines walked forward with his hand already out, not to Fairbanks, but past him, toward a gray uniform shirt with a faded name tape sewn above the pocket. Devin Gaines looked at that name tape a long moment before he looked at the man's face, and something crossed his own that the crew standing closest would talk about for weeks without ever quite agreeing on what they'd seen. "Ledbetter," the colonel said, "and nothing else. Not yet." By the following morning, the jet had flown 2 clean check circuits and come home holding idle steady as a held breath, and Colonel Gaines stood in the maintenance office with a requalification form in front of him and a decision to make that had nothing to do with engines. "I want him entered as technician of record," he told Master Sergeant Purdy. "Not a commendation, the actual maintenance record. I want his name on the discrepancy correction. Permanent." "Colonel, that means reopening the 2013 file on this tail number," Purdy said. "That file's under the Fairbanks contract. It's proprietary. We don't even have red access without their sign-off." Gaines set the form down slow, like it had gotten heavier while he wasn't looking. "Then get their sign-off." Spencer Fairbanks, when asked, did not say no. He did something worse, which was to say yes with his mouth and stall with everything else. A scheduling conflict, a data migration issue, a legal review that would take, he said, a reasonable window, in the tone of a man buying himself road he hadn't yet built. The flyover was 2 days out now, close enough that the base's public affairs office had already printed the programs, and every hour Fairbanks spent finding reasons the file couldn't be opened was an hour the colonel spent watching him do it. It was the archive clerk, a soft-spoken civilian named Nell. No relation, just a coincidence that made Otis go quiet for a moment the first time he heard her name spoken aloud in the hallway, who found the thread without meaning to. She'd pulled the tail number's full maintenance history while waiting on Fairbanks's sign-off, working from the unrestricted summary index rather than the sealed file itself, and she brought Colonel Gaines a single printed page with a service bulletin number circled in pencil. "This bulletin," she said, "authorized a fuel control linkage substitution on this tail number in 2013. Cost reduction measure, approved fleet-wide. I looked up who wrote it." She turned the page around so he could read the letterhead himself. "Fairbanks Diagnostics authored it. Same firm holding the file that won't open." Gaines read it twice. 11 years, he said, mostly to the empty half of the room. 11 years they've been telling this whole fleet a part is fine because their own bulletin said to install it in the first place. He did not raise his voice. He folded the page once, the way a man folds something he intends to carry a long way, and went to find Spencer Fairbanks. Spencer had spent the 2 days since the courtesy demonstration doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with fuel systems. A reopened file meant a documented substitution, and a documented substitution meant a contract renewal vote 2 weeks out that his father's company could not survive intact. So on the morning before the flyover, with the jet fueled and parked in green across every readout for the 3rd day running, Spencer Fairbanks filed a maintenance discrepancy of his own, an unauthorized post-repair modification. His own language, citing Otis's uncertified adjustment as grounds to reground the aircraft pending a full compliance review. It might have worked if Colonel Gaines hadn't already been holding a folded page with a bulletin number circled on it. He found Spencer in the hangar office, laptop open, flowchart still clipped inside his jacket like it might still save him. Gaines set the folded page on the desk without a word and let Spencer read it himself. "You wrote this," Gaines said. 2013. Your signature block's on the 2nd page. "I didn't write that," Spencer said, and something in his voice had gone thinner than the confidence he'd walked in with 9 days before. "I was 23. I hadn't even joined the firm yet." He turned the page, read the block again, and Gaines watched the exact moment a man's understanding of his own inheritance came apart in his hands. "That's my father's signature, not mine. He wrote this." "Your firm's still collecting on it," Gaines said. 11 years of maintenance contracts built on a bulletin that put a part in this fleet that was never supposed to be there. Ledbetter found it in 40 minutes with a stick and a piece of brass. Your company's had 9 days and $600,000 of equipment and hasn't found it yet, because your equipment was built by someone who already knew what the answer was supposed to be. Spencer didn't argue. He sat with the page a long moment, and the room was quiet except for the tick of the laptop fan winding down, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't a defense. "He never told me what it was," he said. "He just told me it was solid, that the fleet-wide job was the best work he ever signed his name to." He looked up. "I've spent 11 years telling people the same thing. I believed it because he did." Gaines let that sit before he answered. "Then help me open the file," he said. "Not because I'm asking, because you're the only one who still can before the vote." Colonel Gaines convened what he called, without any formality in the phrase, a chance for Otis to give his account, and it happened in the maintenance bay rather than any office, with the corrected jet parked visible through the open bay door, as if it had been invited too. Otis stood square to the small gathered group the way he stood square to everything, and when Gaines asked him plainly how he'd known to look where the 12-man team hadn't, Otis reached into the canvas roll one more time and drew out something none of them had seen before, a single sheet of paper, folded into quarters so long ago the creases had gone soft as cloth. The ink faded to the brown of old tea. 1979, he said. "I found the same bind in a different airframe. Younger tech installed the wrong linkage off a supply substitution nobody flagged, same shoulder radius problem, same clean readings on cold test." He held the page but didn't open it yet. "I fixed it myself. Off the books. Never filed the discrepancy. This here's the report I wrote up that same week and never turned in." The room stayed quiet in the particular way rooms stay quiet when they've stopped expecting to be entertained and started expecting to learn something. "Why not file it?" Gaines asked, not as an accusation, just as a door left open for him to walk through. "Kid's name was on the work order," Otis said. 21 years old. One mistake, corrected before it ever left the hangar, nobody hurt. I figured a man ought to get more than one chance before the Air Force decides he's not worth a second." He looked down at the folded page in his hand. "I told myself I'd file it eventually. Once it didn't cost him anything to have it on record. Kept telling myself that a long time." He unfolded it at last, careful along the worn creases, and set it flat on the workbench for Colonel Gaines to see. A discrepancy report, dated, signed, describing in a young man's neat block handwriting the exact fault that had just grounded a jet 45 years later. "I wrote this out at my kitchen table," Otis said, quieter now, and something in the room leaned in without moving. "My wife Nell was still up doing the dishes. She asked what I was working on and I told her, and she said, 'Well, finish it then and go to bed.' I never did finish it. Not the filing part." He ran 2 fingers along the fold, the same motion, twice, before he set the gauge down beside it. She's been gone 14 years now. I expect she thought I'd turned it in a long time before that. He folded the page again, along the same soft creases, and set it into Colonel Gaines's hand rather than back into the roll, the first time in 45 years it had left his own custody. Then he lifted the brass gauge, wrapped it back into its scrap of cloth with the same 3 motions he always used, the same motions a much younger man had used the first night he ever brought it home, and set it on a kitchen table for a woman named Nell Ledbetter to admire, in a kitchen that no longer exists, in a house long since sold to people who never knew what had once been made true inside it. Nobody in that maintenance bay clapped this time. It wasn't that kind of quiet. The flyover went up at 9 o'clock on schedule, 3 jets in formation catching low morning light over a stadium that had no idea what 40 minutes of listening had cost or saved, and the F-16 held its position in the formation as steady as anything in the sky that day. Otis watched it from the tarmac with his cart parked at brake beside him, one hand shading his good eye, and Sawyer Prescott stood near enough to hear him say, not to anyone in particular, "There she goes," in the voice of a man releasing something he'd been holding a long while. Spencer Fairbanks reopened his father's file himself the following week, rather than wait for anyone to make him, walked it personally into the review board, and told them plainly what it contained and what it had cost. The contract renewal vote went against his firm, and it should have ended things between him and Hollisfield entirely, except that Colonel Gaines, of all people, was the one who suggested the smaller consulting arrangement that came after Dowell and Gage listening checks written into Fairbanks's own diagnostic flowchart as a mandatory step before any fault tree could be closed out clean. A line item that read, in Spencer's own handwriting on the laminated card he still carried, "Confirm no undocumented substitution by physical inspection. Instrument cannot verify absence." He kept that card clipped inside his jacket the same as always. He read from it a little less like scripture now, and a little more like something he'd had to earn the right to believe. Months later, past the last of that year's flyovers and into a winter, the flight line took in stride the way it took everything. A glass case went up on the maintenance bay wall, bolted at eye height beside the tool crib, and inside it sat one hand-filed brass gauge, its edges gone soft with age, 2 crooked initials stamped into one flat face by a 19-year-old who hadn't yet learned to stamp them straight. Underneath it, in its same corner of the bay, unremarkable as it had ever been, sat a mop cart with a canvas roll folded neatly on top. Unlocked now, because there was nothing left inside it that needed keeping from the world. Some of the best hands in any hangar are the ones nobody thought to ask twice.